Buju, Nin, Cassandra Spade, Nishnikas, Mishki Gogomang and Donji, Nemain Do Dim Gaye, Kuchichingish Gunaganing, Ingi Beak. Hello, everyone. My name is Cassandra Spade. I'm from Mishki Gogomang First Nation, and I come from the Sturgeon clan. Today, I'm very excited and pleased to be sharing with all of you the new unit called Indigenous Grassroots Activism. It is filled with 6 different lessons around developing new skills, tools, strategies, and knowledge around activism. At the same time, I'm going to be sharing a lot about my lived experience and where I come from and my own activism as a way of sharing what I've learned throughout the years with all of you. And so you can take whatever resonates or is relevant or connects to you, and you can use it in whichever ways you see fit. At the same time, I'm just really hoping that this unit will develop some new ideas in all of you so that you can go out and you can create and engage in change in your communities in ways that best reflect who you are and what you hope to see in your community. So in saying that, understanding that we have a lot of power in our communities and that we come from very unique places. And once we understand the power of our community and we understand how we are related to our community or how we fit into it, we understand who we are. And in doing so, we can create a lot of meaningful change in our communities. So first and foremost, I'm going to be sharing a little bit about myself and really introducing myself to all of you. So I'm going to talk about my story and where I am today and how I got here. And in doing so, I hope you can see that lived experience is so necessary to activism, and it's so necessary to connecting to people when you share your story, and that your story is very unique, and it's unique to you, and it's very distinct, and it will take you to a lot of new places. So when I was growing up in my community, I also grew up on a community called Kuchiching First Nation, and I wanted to create a lot of change. I knew I wanted to create change in my community, but I did not know how. And so everyone told me that if you want to create change, you have to become a lawyer. They can change the laws, they can change policies, and they can bring meaningful change. And so I thought at that time that that was the only way to do it. And so I finished high school and I went on to university, and I ended up studying in a history program with German language. And before you go to law school, you have to get some kind of degree at university. And so this is what I was doing. And while I was at university, I started to think a lot about my community, and I started to think about my connection to it and what it means to me. At the same time, being so far away from my community because I was going to university. And as a result of this, I started to feel very lonely and very disconnected and very isolated. And I missed being at home. I missed it a lot. And so when I finished my first degree, I wasn't sure if I immediately wanted to go to law school. I knew I wanted to create change. I wanted to be successful. I wanted to do something in my community that would benefit other people. But I was really starting to feel sad and lonely and disconnected and lost because I was away for so long. And law school would take me away from home for another 3 years. And so I put down some tobacco and I asked for some guidance because I really wasn't sure what I was doing. And so a week later, I had this dream where I was running through a birch bark forest, and there were all of these trees around me, and there was moss and there was water, and there was a lot of rocks and natural things, and I was running. And I started to run on an incline, and I started to go higher and higher and faster and faster. And the momentum started to push me. When I had tried to stop, I almost couldn't stop. And as I approached the cliff, I stopped just at the top because I was running on an incline. And I reached the top of the cliff, and I was able to stop just in time before I fell over. And when I stopped at the top of the cliff, I looked out and all I saw was concrete. There was no more birch bark trees. There was no more moss, no more water, no more anything, just gray concrete. And I took this as a sign that I should go back home. And so I withdrew all my applications to law school. And I ended up going back home, and my family was very sad They were asking me, what are you doing? This is so crazy. Why would you not become a lawyer? Don't you want to be successful, and don't you want to make change? And I thought, yes, I do want to do those things, but something is missing, and something very important is missing. And so I went home, and my family was a bit disappointed, but I ended up spending a lot of time with the elders. And I spent time in the bush with them, and they would speak Anishinaabe, and they would interact with one another, and they would talk about the importance of language and culture and being on the land, and how I have a relationship to the land, and why it's so important to have a relationship, because it connects you to who you are. And shortly after that, I got a phone call from a man named Fontaine, who is one of the first people to speak openly and publicly about the residential school system on television. He also led the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And so he called me, and I said, hello. And he says, hello. Hi, Cassandra. How are you? And I tell him how I am. And he says, I would like to invite you to this International Indigenous Summit on Environmental Rights and Issues. Very long name, and I was very excited, and I accepted. And he said, I would like you to come because you're interested in practicing law, and I think this would be really beneficial for you. So I flew out very shortly after, and I went to the Rocky Mountains to a town called Banff. And next thing I knew, I was sitting at a table with Indigenous and international Indigenous leaders, politicians, television reporters, and Fontaine, and me. And I was starting to feel very small, like I hadn't really done anything in the world, and that I didn't really matter because I didn't do anything, and I came from this small place, and I didn't go to Harvard, and I wasn't a politician, and I didn't star in movies or television and things like that. So I started to feel very small. And I started to talk about where I came from and who I was at the table. And a reporter looks to me and he says, tomorrow, I would like you to take my place on a panel. I want you to talk about where you come from and who you are, and the importance of having a relationship to land, and land having a relationship to you. And I immediately said, no, thank you. I was thinking, I'm a very shy person. I can't even stand in front of a room of two people without shaking. And at that time, I would get so nervous. I would get so scared, and I'd almost start crying, and I was so shy, and I couldn't even look at people other than their shoes. And so I told him no. And he said, tomorrow I will ask you again, but I will ask you 10 minutes before I go on stage. I said, thank you for the offer, and I will think about it. So when I went back to my hotel room and I was getting ready for bed, I started to think about my grandparents. And I started to think about how they were never given the opportunity to speak on a huge stage like that. And even if they tried to speak, how people would not hear or listen to them. And then I started to think about how my grandparents believe in me and why I can't believe in myself. And I started to think, if my grandparents believe in me, I should believe in me, because I love my grandparents and I trust them, and I think the world of them. And so in that moment, I decided, okay, I'm going to speak on that stage tomorrow, and I'm going to do it for my grandparents. And I'm going to pretend they're the only people in the room, and then I'm not talking to anybody else. And so I walked up to that reporter the next day, and I said, I'm going to do it. He was very excited. And next thing I knew, I was walking out onto this little stage, and there were 4 people with me, and there were hundreds of people in the audience, and people like David Suzuki, and politicians, and cameras, and all of these people who went to Harvard, and people who I thought were more important than me. And the first person started speaking, and then the second person started speaking, and then I started speaking. And I started to speak about a specific legal case in Canada. It did not happen in my home community. It happened in northern Manitoba, very close to northern Ontario. And they're called the Say Easy Dene. And in the 1950s, the Canadian government removed them from their community because environmentalists had started advocating, and they'd said the Say Easy Dene were destroying the caribou population. What they did not realize is that in the winter months, the Say Easy Dene hunt many caribou, and when the first snow falls, it falls on top of all of those caribou and acts like a refrigerator. So the community can just walk out into the winter and poke a stick around and pick up a caribou and take it back home. But the environmentalists, they were saying the Saisi are just killing caribou. They do not care about them and they do not understand about them. And they were advocating this to the Canadian government. And so in the 1950s, the Canadian government said, okay, we are listening to the environmentalists because they're advocating, and they removed the Saisi from the land. And as a result, the land started to erode, the caribou population started to decline, and the Saisi Dene population started to decline. What the environmentalists and the government did not realize is that Indigenous people have a relationship to land and a responsibility to it and an obligation, that we are interconnected to land and the animals and plants around us, and we take care of those things and they take care of us. And so to remove us from them is to ultimately hurt the animals and plants and water and land and all of the things that exist. And so it took a very long time for the Canadian government to move the Saisi Dene back. But once they did, the land started to return and the Saisi Dene population started to heal from all of the things that had happened to them. And while I was speaking, I wasn't even aware of what I was talking about. And when I had finished, I had said that it is so important to listen to Indigenous people and Indigenous activists, because we have lived on the lands we are from since the beginning of time, and we know best because we are from those lands. And if the Canadian government had listened to the Saisi Dene instead of the environmental activists, they would have known that. And so activism is so important, and listening to Indigenous people is so important, and understanding where you come from is so important, and that there is power in our communities and power in our identities and knowing who we are. And when I'd finished, everyone had stood up and they started clapping, and I was so nervous. I stood up and I started clapping. And I remember thinking how, because of my grandparents' belief in me and all of the work and all of the love that my grandparents have given me, it has supported me in the person I am today. And so therefore, I want to do that for the future generations. And I realize I'm part of this very long lineage of people, and that I'm never alone in what I am doing or my activism. And therefore, in understanding that I'm part of all of these generations, I understand I have a lot of power and that there are a lot of people who support me. At the same time, in that moment, I started to understand the power of place and how it's so important to recognize the places where we come from, and that it is because of those distinct places that we can talk about very important issues, especially the ones impacting our communities. And I started to realize that lived experience is so important to acknowledge as activism, as a story, as something meaningful, and that all of us have a lived experience, and all of those lived experiences mean something. And so in that moment in time, I learned a lot. And when I flew home, I started to think, do I still want to become a lawyer? How do I want to bring change to my community? And what does this mean? And very shortly after, I got another phone call. I got a phone call from Anishinaabe Nation asking me if I'd like to meet the Prime Minister of Canada. And I thought, whoa, that's so crazy. He is considered the most powerful person in Canada. And then there's me. And I'm still thinking, I can't be as powerful as him. He's the Prime Minister of Canada. And Anishinaabe Nation flew us out with 19 other youth to Ottawa. And we had a very small private meeting with him. And during that time, we all spoke about things we want to change in our communities and what we wanted to see happen. And I had to think about, what do I want to see in my community and what's very important to me? And I started to think about the importance of language, Indigenous languages. And I started to think about the importance of education and having education in our home communities, so we're not separated from our families or the ones we love. And that this education needs to reflect the types of lives we live. So it needs to have our language, it needs to have our culture, it needs to have all of the things that make our communities ours. And I started to think about the importance of young people. And so when we talked to the Prime Minister, that's what I talked to him about. reimagining education, making Indigenous languages protected and official languages of Canada, talking about the need to include youth in spaces of power and decision-making, and talking to youth as activists. And when I left that room, I started to realize I am just as powerful as that man. And because I understand who I am and where I come from, there's so much power in that. And I can talk to him and not feel like I am less than or more than, but I am powerful because I know who I am and where I'm from. Next, I got a phone call where I actually started to do a lot of different engagements and public speaking and just talking in whatever kind of ways I could. And so these little videos would circulate Facebook. And I get a phone call one night on Valentine's Day, surprisingly, and an elder, she said, "Cassandra, I saw a video of you talking about language and the importance of it, and I want you to go to the United Nations, and I want you to talk about this." And I thought, wow, an international stage in a place that's so far away and so big, because the United Nations is in New York. And so I accepted and I flew out to New York, and I was standing among millions and millions of people, and I was missing home mostly because home is what I love the most. And so the next day when I went to the United Nations, there were all of these people from very distinct places, from Brazil and Germany and Japan and wherever they came from. And they all were distinct pockets of identity or unique places of being, and all had lived experiences to share. And I started to think I also have all of those things to share, and I have a unique perspective, and I have power in the things that I say because I understand my community, I know where I come from, I know who I am, I recognize that I am part of a long line of people, and that my community is part of me, and I'm part of my community. And so when I spoke about Indigenous languages and education and the need for these things to be reimagined and protected, I was not as nervous as I was the first time. And I went home and I started to think, I started to think about all of the ways to make change, and that law is just one way to make change, and that there are many, many different ways to make change in our communities. And law is a successful way, but so is activism, and so is growing a garden in your community, so is becoming a teacher. Whatever you do to participate and be a part of your community is a successful way of making change. And I started to realize that. And although one day I may go to law school and I may choose to do that, right now what I am enjoying the most is being involved in activism and education and working on Indigenous languages and working in immersion schools. So all that to say, there are many ways to be successful and to create change. And this unit is really what I'm trying to do, is develop skills and tools and share those things with you so that you can go and make meaningful change in your own communities in ways that best reflect who you are. And at the same time, acknowledging our lived experience as power and our communities as power and who we are as people, the way we identify as power. And that has led me today to be the founder of an organization called Ga Minwachin Dizawach, which is a language revitalization organization that supports Indigenous youth in developing networks, leadership skills, and other programming around language and cultural skills. So that's where I am today. Today, I thought we would do a quick overview on what grassroots activism is and really get into the nitty-gritty of this and build a foundational understanding so that we can work from this foundation in our next units. So we'll talk about grassroots activism, we'll talk about community, social change, and interconnectedness. Grassroots activism is just talking about a movement of self-organizing and people who come together in collective action at the most local level. So people organizing and coming together in our communities, in our towns, cities, maybe a specific area in a city, and they're advocating for change, and they want change to be made. The activism part is that there is a policy or action of campaigning to bring about political, economic, or social change. So to change the government and laws, the political sphere. Economic is all about finance and trade and money. So changing something around that. And social change, which is when we want to change social aspects of our culture. And we're going to see that it requires a lot of time. When we talk about community, community is foundational to activism. So community, it can come in 3 different forms or many different forms. It can be a group of people living in a geographic region. So our cities, our towns, our reservations, First Nation communities. It's a geographic area, land, or region. Next, we can talk about a community with similar identities. So this is when, for example, I identify as a woman, so I'm part of a community of other people who identify as a woman or are seen as a woman. It can also be things like an elder who identifies as an elder and is a part of the elder community. Next, we have a community of people who share common interests and goals and attitudes. And this could be a group of people who perhaps are very passionate about activism and want to create immersion space for Anishinaabe language or Indigenous language. And so they share a common interest of Indigenous languages and they come together. And so those are 3 forms of community. So I want you to understand that community can mean many different things. It is not just a geographic region. It can encompass many more things. And that we are all part of many different communities. Next, we'll talk about social change. And as I was saying, activism aims to change something such as the political, the economic, or this thing called social change, which is changing cultural and social systems, structures, and institutions. And it requires a large amount of time. So when we really want to bring about meaningful change, or we want to change something, it can take a long time to do. And these are things like, for example, in Canada, women cannot wear pants until the 60s and 70s. And so it took a long time to create activism and change that and advocate that women can wear pants, they can wear skirts, they can wear whatever they want. And so social change takes a long time. Next, we talk about this idea of interconnectedness. And this is the idea that we are all interconnected to one another. We all have relationships and responsibilities and obligations to one another, meaning that we are all part of a community, and that community is made up of people like us. And so what we do impacts other people. But also in saying this, we recognize we are related to not just people, but the land, animals, plants, and all the things around us. So interconnectedness is really important to activism because we recognize our relationships to people and beings around us. So in summary of today's lesson, we focused on some foundational pieces of activism. We talked about what grassroots activism is, understanding it's the most local level, the grassroots level, and it's advocating to create change in the political, economic, or social sphere. We talked about all those different ways of community or different identifying communities. It could be land, it could be shared identities or shared interests and goals and things like that. So community is not just a region or a piece of land that people live on. It can be many things, and you can be part of many communities. Next, we talked about social change and how this is changing cultural and social systems, structures, and institutions, and requires a lot of time. It takes a long time to create meaningful change, but that's okay. And lastly, we talked about this idea of interconnectedness, the understanding that we all have relationships to one another, we all have obligations, we all take care of one another, and we are all a part of a community. And so we want to think about what are we giving our communities and what do they give us? Or what do we give others and what do they give us? Understanding that interconnectedness means what we do impact someone and vice versa. And so in saying all of these things, these pieces are just really foundational to grassroots activism. And I think you can pull little pieces from the story I shared with you about my own activism. And so I look forward to the other lessons with all of you and talking a little bit more about activism and how to build new skills and strategies and sharing new knowledge and tools with you so that you can go out into your communities and make meaningful change in a way that best reflects you and who you are. So, miigwech, thank you for listening.